And we welcome in former Canucks, Leafs, Jets, and Coyotes executive, former Dunbar resident, if I'm not mistaken, Laurence Gilman.
That would be correct. 7 years.
Yeah, so your home white spot would have been the one on Broadway there, down in Kitts?
That is correct. It was a very popular spot with one Tyler Gilman back in the day.
I'm sure it was.
It was his favorite place to go in Rogers Arena, too.
Oh, wow. Yeah, we do the same thing. Families in town, we hit to that white spot right there on Broadway. Good to see you. Thanks for taking time again. We've drawn some parallels ourselves between the naming of Quinn Hughes as Vancouver Canucks captain and what you guys back in the day did with Henrik Sedin there in terms of empowering a guy who was a great player who maybe didn't have the most full-throated voice in the room. Like your take on what the Canucks did in naming Quinn Hughes as captain and what you've seen from him in the past year or so in terms of leadership.
First of all, there are many ways that leaders communicate, and in the normal lore of hockey, there's a famous story of Mark Messier when he signed with the New York Rangers and was named captain, and they walked him into the dressing room and he saw a ping pong table in the middle of the room. And he said, "Get rid of this thing because I want to look every teammate in the eye when I'm sitting in my stall." Not every leader leads in that manner. And, with respect to Quinn Hughes, I have to say, watching him play against the Florida Panthers earlier in the season, I had what I would call an aha moment, which was not dissimilar to the aha moment I had 3 or 4 games into my Canucks tenure, when I realized that Henrik and Daniel Sundin were not just the best second-line players in the National Hockey League, but in one shift, I realized that they could be 2 of the most skilled players on the planet. My perception of Quinn Hughes was that he was one of the best, quote-unquote, offensemen in the National Hockey League. And I thought that his attention to detail in the defensive zone and his competitiveness was not really there. That changed for me in one game. And I watched him do things in that game against Florida that were astonishing to me, particularly in the defensive zone, where he made plays that very few hockey players can do under pressure with very little time and very little space. And I realized that he processes the game in an absolutely elite manner. And when you compare that to the skill set he has, he's an incredibly effective defender, far better than I ever had imagined. In addition, I watched him play in the first period where he took the puck down the left boards to the hash marks, turned around and basically fired the puck tape to tape to one of Florida's right wingers and created a turnover, and the Panthers started to head up the ice. You could see it in his eyes. He was so pissed off. He caught the guy in about 5 or 6 strides in the neutral zone, lifted his stick, stole the puck, and turned the other way, and the Canucks had an offensive zone entry. And that said to me that this kid is a far greater competitor than I ever thought. And it really was a sledgehammer-like moment. And translating that to the captaincy, when you have a player that is that elite skill, that can play as well as he does in both ends of the ice and competes as hard as he does, that's Henrik Sedin, really. I mean, that's what you want from your captain. It doesn't have to be a guy who stands up and screams in the dressing room. Joe Sakic, I do not believe, was that type of captain either. But it's a player who leads by example, goes out and competes every shift, and sets the tone for the team in that regard. And, one needs to look no further than the metrics of, possession and shot attempts that occur when Quinn Hughes is on the ice versus times when he is not. He is a seminal part of that team. There are some great players on that team, Elias Pettersson, JT Miller. But make no mistake, this guy's the heartbeat of the team.
I think you and Mike would have liked this player because you guys understood puck possession being defense. And I think for a lot of people, it took them a while to realize that from a defenseman. People had eventually wrapped their heads around that with regards to the Sedin, is that because they have the puck all the time, that's them playing defense effectively. And for Quinn Hughes, that's effectively it too. You talked about his speed there and coming back. He has some speed, but he's not like Paul Coffey, the fastest guy on the ice kind of speed. But he is just so quick and nimble that again, the ability to elude people while he's defending in the defensive zone when he gets the puck as a defenseman, and then to just help keep possession of the puck in the offensive zone, that in and of itself is defense, isn't it?
Well, it is. I mean, if you look at, we looked at some metrics when we were running the Canucks, and one of them was possession. And there is a threshold of possession that Stanley Cup champions up until that year, I can't speak for the years since we left, but there was a threshold of possession that Stanley Cup winning teams had. And, Paul Coffey used to say it when he played. People would deride him for the lapses in his game defensively. And he used to say something like, if you're possessing the puck, that's pretty good defense. And it's true. The puck is on a stick all the time. And when it's on his stick or Quinn Hughes' stick, it isn't going to be in the opposition stick and won't wind up at the back of your net.
Laurence, what would you do with a struggling Elias Pettersson, and how important is body language and outward emotion, and when I say outward emotion, I mean more joy than anything else when you come to the dressing room day after day?
I don't have an answer to that question, Matt. He's a listen. We all want them to be, fiery, upbeat, funny, gregarious. But, Elias Pettersson is a virtuoso, and I've never met him. I don't know him, but he seems somewhat aloof in the manner in which he carries himself. And he is, sort of has this distant, sort of hollow look about him at some point. But he's an unbelievable hockey player. And I don't know what the buttons are that you need to push necessarily on this player. I think he's going to come around at some point in the season, get his groove, and is going to be one of the elite centers in the National Hockey League that he is. It's definitely not, coaches, the ultimate whip that coaches have is ice time. And, you can do things to more or less punish a player by taking him off the power play or moving him from the first unit to the second or not having him out on the ice at the end of the game. I'm not sure this player is the type that's going to respond to that sort of behavior. I think, part of what may be at play here is a lack of maturity. As a young player who, social media gets to some of these players, and that could be the case in this instance. Elias Pettersson has to just, grow up, and not to say that he's immature, but it's part of a maturation process that players go through. And there are periods where you're frustrated, but you got to just, work through it. And I believe that he's going to get there.
So talk to me about body language then. I mean, Cliff Fletcher was one of your mentors. You worked with Gretzky in Arizona, Alain here in Vancouver, guys like Lou and Babcock in Toronto. Like, talk to me about body language and whether or not you feel like there's a general consensus there amongst NHL managers, coaches, and how important it is on a day-to-day basis.
Well, it is important, and you don't want players sulking in your room or around the team. It's draining to the rest of the players. One of the most effective coaches and coaching tandems that I worked with was Rick Bowness and Alain Vigneault. And Alain could be hard on players at times, and Rick Bowness was the perfect foil in that regard. And he would, put his arm around Alex Edler if Alex was down about something, and he had this infectious ability to, lighten up the room or get to a specific player. I don't know the makeup of the coaching staff of the Vancouver Canucks, but hopefully there is someone among that group, and it doesn't have to be a coach, it can be a teammate as well, that, takes it upon themselves to monitor this player and try and bring him into the group on a greater basis, which in turn will, probably have a positive impact on his mood.
And maybe that's what JT Miller was trying to do in his own way. We'll get more to JT Miller in just a second and their little skirmish in practice. But we've organically made the comparison to Roberto Luongo with Elias Pettersson and his attitude, and that both seem to have this arm's length relationship with the media, sometimes prickly, but more times just kind of weird and aloof, more than prickly. And there was this sense of being done wrong by the media at times, and maybe by the game as a general rule. Just odd. And then something changed for Roberto Luongo, and I think it overall helped his game. And this is post Pump My Tires, I think. This is more in chapter 2 of his tenure with the Vancouver Canucks, where he really was able to wrap his head around his role in the universe, if you will. Do you remember how that came to be? I think you've told us this story before, or these stories before, but maybe there's a parallel there for Elias Pettersson to find some peace in the world.
Well, in the case of Roberto Luongo, he might not have liked you guys very much. And when I say you guys, I use the euphemism.
The general, yes.
The Pat Quinn, you people. But Roberto Luongo was incredibly well liked within the four walls of the Canucks dressing room. I mean, he was a great teammate. There's, throughout time, there have been hockey players and athletes and entertainers who have disdain for the media. One can have that type of feeling towards the media and still be an effective hockey player. Mm-hmm. And again, in Roberto's case, I think, he came from a market in Florida where there isn't much coverage of the team. There wasn't much coverage of the team. You can really do your own thing and move around without scrutiny, to one of the more exacting hockey markets in the National Hockey League on the planet, in Vancouver, particularly at that time when you had, 2 newspapers, multiple radio stations, and just a plethora of media people competing for stories. And I think, like Elias Pettersson, as we spoke about earlier, took Roberto a little while to feel comfortable in his own skin in dealing with the media. And at some point, he got to the point where it didn't bother him anymore. And, he was at ease with it, and he didn't care. And he had made a lot of money. He had been a successful goaltender. He was on a great team. And all of that just makes life a lot better. He had gotten married, had kids. That changes you as well. I mean, there are a lot of things that go into the evolution of a hockey player or anybody else that walks this planet.
The other comparison I wanted to make, and they're not always going to fit so tidily into comparisons for your tenure with the Vancouver Canucks, but I think this one does too, in that you guys had a prickly SOB in Ryan Kesler that you needed to funnel that energy into the right spots. The Canucks had JT Miller, who was very similar, and I think he's even done probably a better job than Ryan Kesler in terms of finding the right ways to channel that exuberant energy. He was tempestuous. He was, explosive in a bad way for a couple of years. But my goodness, has he turned into a true leader of this team, the heartbeat of this team, and to the point where maybe that's what was behind the little skirmish with Elias Pettersson last week in practice. But talk about what you've seen there, and if it does remind you of Kesler at all.
Well, there's a lot of, I don't know JT Miller at all. And
Mm-hmm.
obviously I know Ryan particularly well, but I do see a lot of similar qualities in them. They are both surly. There's a surliness to their game. There's a nastiness to their game with respect to how they relate to other players. And they get pissed off when things don't go their way. Both players elicit the same traits. And I think there are times when they hold their teammates accountable in a manner that probably makes their teammates uncomfortable. And the Elias Pettersson incident that happened at practice is probably a pretty good comparison. I mean, I can't recall a specific, there were times when Ryan Kesler was angry with his teammates and they were angry at him. I don't recall specifically an incident where there was anything that went on between two of our players, but I look at JT Miller, and when I see him, he brings his Canucks teammates into the fight, right? Kesler had the same qualities, I look back on that national series we won in the second round in 2011. I mean, Ryan Kesler put the team on his back and, made it happen. I watched that game in Florida where, the Canucks somehow managed to get to overtime, and he scored that unbelievable goal to win. I mean, he put the team on his back in that instance. And there are similarities in that regard. And JT Miller is an effective player, and his demeanor and his nastiness and his Ryan Kesler-like persona. I think it's serving the Canucks as well today as Kesler's persona did to us when he was in his heyday.
Laurence, help us out here, because what the Canucks are doing. Once upon a time, you were charged with knowing the deep recesses of the CBA, having expertise on that document and on the cap, and of course, compliance. Eric Branstrom.
Right
Yeah, very good.
It's never far away.
Eric Branstrom, 30 days or 10 games before becoming waiver eligible. And they're sending Branstrom and Baines down to Abbotsford and calling them up in between games when both teams are here in the Lower Mainland to accrue cap space. Explain the waiver eligibility first, and then how much cap space can you actually accrue 48 hours or 24 hours at a time?
How worth it is it?
Yeah.
Well, I'll give you an example on that in a minute. But to explain the 1030 rule, once a player clears waivers, you can recall him, and he can go up and down as many times as you want him to go up and down until one of two things occurs. Either 30 days have passed or he plays 10 games. And once one of those triggers hit, he can't be sent down without clearing waivers again. So if you use Branstrom as an example, Branstrom's had a pretty good tenure since he's been recalled. And teams are always looking for a defenseman. So if you're the Vancouver Canucks, you probably, well, no, it's not probably, it's a prudent maneuver. Send him down. So obviously there's no games being played, so you're not going to get to the 10-game mark. But what often happens is you get to the 30-day mark faster. So you're just buying yourself a little more time. Like that's a competent move by a management team. As far as the accrual of cap space goes, best way that I can explain it to you is the salary cap for this season is at $88 million. But it's calculated per day. And there are 186 days in an average NHL season. I don't know if that's the exact number here, but let's just use that as an example.
Traditionally, sure, yeah.
So if a team is $1 million below the cap on day one of the season and stays that way till the end and doesn't make another transaction, which is never going to happen, at $1 million below the cap, that team is saving exactly $5,376 per day in salary cap space. So from the start of the season to the trade deadline, by my calculation, it's 136 days. So if you take that number of 5,376 and you multiply it by 136 days, you get roughly $731,000 in accrued space. Bear in mind, there's 50, and again, it's a 186-day season, so there's 50 days left. So you have $731,000 to spend in the next 50 days. Now, a player, and I did a little math on this, a player who's a $4 million player, divided by 186 days in the season, is making $21,500 a day. So if you multiply that by 50 days, that's roughly $1 million. So you can't fit a $4 million player in at the trade deadline. But if you start dropping the number, a $3 million player is making $16,000 a day, which roughly translates to $800,000 worth of space.
So you're there almost. Yeah.
Well, but bear in mind, moves don't come in without there's tandem moves that made. So if you think about it, if you start moving out other players, suddenly you can add a $5 million player, right? Like if you send $1 million player out and you've accrued all this space, you can add a $5 million player. So that's how the salary cap works. So if you have the luxury of entry-level players or players that don't require waivers for whatever period, if you're sending them down, again, $1 million, being $1 million below the cap gets you $5,376 a day. That's a lot of accrual up until the trade deadline. That's how the cap works.
And that's what they're doing this year, and that's what they seem intent on doing when both the Abbotsford Canucks and Vancouver Canucks are here in the Lower Mainland. It's easy to do. And these are technically paper transactions, Laurence. Like the player doesn't actually have to go and report to Abbotsford.
Open the door in Abbott.
That isn't true, actually. The player does have to go. The only time the league allows a paper transaction is on the day of the trade deadline, because sometimes you'll send a guy down 5 minutes before the trade deadline and recall him afterwards. If you recall, when we gerrymandered the roster to maximize our LTI space in 2011. We sent Corey Schneider and Jeff Tambellini down to the Moose, even though we knew they were going to play game one. I had to explain to these guys, unfortunately, you have to get on a plane and fly to Winnipeg, because the NHL knew what we were doing, and they said, if these guys are coming back, we better see plane tickets.
So what happens when it's a driving trip to Abbotsford? Do Arshdeep and Eric actually have to get in the car and go drive out to Abbotsford Center?
Well, that is what is supposed to happen. I don't know that the NHL is sending their salary cap police to the lower mainland to make sure that these guys are down there. But they're not supposed to be practicing with the team.
Right.
So, one of you people, as I referred to earlier, sees them on the ice or at the arena and does what you guys do, which is report it.
Right.
The Canucks could be in trouble.
But that is the beauty of the in-market AHL team, isn't it? Where these sorts of minor inconveniences get avoided.
Yeah.
So,
well, it's a huge benefit to do it. I mean, it isn't just a huge benefit for the salary cap purposes. It also, from a practical standpoint, if you get a guy that steps on a puck in a morning skate, and turns an ankle, and your team is in Abbotsford, you have the ability to get a defenseman in an hour.
And wear and tear on the players, though, jumping on planes back and forth, all that sort of stuff, right?
Yeah, so. It's not like sending them on planes, trains, and buses down to Utica. Or
right.
Utica
in particular, yeah.
I will accept you people. I will not accept you people erasure. Gilman, did you hear him? In a market where there's 2 papers. There was 3 when you guys managed.
Really? 3 papers?
The Globe and Mail?
Oh, I just...
I thought about that after I said it, Matt. I apologize.
No, it's okay. It was the one that Gillis read. I knew that. He had a subscription. We figured that one out. Thank you for this, Laurence. Until next Wednesday. Appreciate it.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.